The morning had started the way most mornings at Windsor did, quietly, heavily, like the castle itself was still deciding whether to wake up. Fog sat low across the grounds, pressing itself against the stone walls, curling around the iron fence posts where the sentries stood in their red coats and black bearskins, still as paintings. The gravel paths were damp. The roses in the east garden were barely open. Somewhere deep inside the palace, a clock struck 7, and the sound moved through the corridors like a slow wave. Princess Charlotte had been awake since 5. She was 9 years old, and already knew that being awake before the world was one of the only ways to have the world to herself. She sat in the window seat of her bedroom on the 2nd floor, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the fog move. She had her grandmother's old book of British birds in her lap, the pages soft from years of being turned, and the spine cracked at the robin and the sparrow chapters from being opened there so many times. She wasn't reading it. She was just holding it. It was one of those mornings. Below her window in the courtyard, she could see him. James Calloway, Royal Protection Officer, assigned to the Princess of Wales household 8 months ago. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that looked like it had been arranged specifically to give nothing away. He stood near the fountain in the center of the courtyard with his arms loose at his sides and his eyes doing that thing they always did, moving, scanning, returning, moving again, a slow and constant sweep of everything around him. He wasn't looking at her. He never appeared to be looking at her. But she had tested this. 3 times she had waved from the window, and 3 times within 4 seconds he had looked up. She waved now. 4 seconds. His eyes came up. A small nod. She pressed her nose to the glass and fogged it with her breath, then drew a bird in the condensation with one finger. A lumpy, unconvincing bird that looked more like a shoe with wings. She looked back down at him. He had already returned his gaze to the courtyard perimeter. This was the entire relationship, and she found it completely satisfying. James Calloway had not expected to feel anything in particular about this assignment. So he had come from 6 years with the Metropolitan Police and 2 years on a prior protection detail, a cabinet minister who spent most of his time in cars and conference rooms and smelled permanently of printer toner. That assignment had been quiet in the way that made you soft. This one was not quiet. A 9-year-old girl with too much energy and a talent for appearing in unexpected places was a different kind of challenge than a minister who moved in straight lines and predictable patterns. And she had once appeared behind him in the kitchen at 6 a.m., asking if he knew what a cassowary was. He had not known what a cassowary was. She had explained it to him in considerable detail while eating toast, and he had stood there in his suit and tie at 6 in the morning learning about a large, dangerous bird native to Australia from a child who was still in her pajamas. When she left, he had looked it up to verify. Everything she said was accurate, and he had added cassowaries to his mental file under things that can kill you that I wasn't previously worried about. He had not told her this, but he had started carrying a small notebook. There were 17 birds in it now. The morning briefing was at 8. James stood at the back of the room while the household coordinator, Mrs. Albright, walked through the day's schedule in her particular style, efficient, precise, and with the energy of someone who had been doing this long enough that nothing surprised her and she preferred it that way. The princess and her family were hosting a small delegation from a visiting European royal family. There would be a late morning greeting in the blue drawing room, a formal luncheon, a garden walk in the afternoon if the weather cooperated, and a short informal tea before the delegation departed at 5. The children, Mrs. Albright said, looking up from her papers, will interact briefly during the garden portion. The visiting family has 2 children, 8 and 11. It is hoped to be relaxed. James marked the transition points. Drawing room to dining room back to residential wing to garden to wherever, Every doorway, every staircase, every moment where a crowd shifted or thinned. This was what the work actually was, not drama, not action. Mapping the day before it became the day. Charlotte was dressed by 9. She stood in the corridor outside her room while her mother's lady-in-waiting made small adjustments to the sash on her dress. A pale blue that matched nothing she would have chosen herself, but looked, Charlotte had to admit on inspecting the mirror, quite respectable. She stood still for the adjustments the way she had been taught, with her hands folded in front of her and her chin level, which was more patience than she usually had available. James stood at the end of the corridor. She could see him past the lady-in-waiting's shoulder. She looked at him and crossed her eyes. He did not react. His eyes continued their sweep. But the absolute controlled blankness of his face, the very determined no reaction, told her that he had seen it, and she smiled at the floor. The blue drawing room was a room that had been designed specifically to make people feel they were in a room designed to impress them, and it did this with considerable success. Gold everything. Paintings in frames that cost more than cars, chairs that looked comfortable and were not. Charlotte stood beside her parents while the visiting delegation was introduced, and she shook hands with the correct amount of firmness. Not too much. Not too little, she had been told, find the middle, and said the right things in the right order. The visiting family's daughter, who was 8 and named Elise, had dark eyes and was watching Charlotte with an expression of open, uncomplicated assessment. Charlotte assessed her back. "Do you know what a cassowary is?" Charlotte asked, because this was a reasonable test. Elise's expression flickered. "A bird," she said. "It can kill you." Charlotte decided immediately that she liked her. James, from his position near the door, noted the exchange. He filed it. 2 children now instead of 1. The morning moved. The luncheon was the luncheon. Long, formal. Full of adult conversation over Charlotte's head that she tracked with half her attention and mostly ignored. She ate carefully, the way she was supposed to, and kept her elbows off the table and answered when she was spoken to. Elise, across the table, was doing the same with the slightly rigid posture of someone performing behavior rather than living it, and Charlotte recognized this because she was doing the same thing and appreciated the company. And afterwards the children were moved to the small sitting room while the adults continued their conversation, and this was where Charlotte's day shifted. It started with the door. A member of the visiting delegation's household staff, a man Charlotte hadn't seen before in a dark suit carrying a leather document case, walked past the sitting room door, paused, looked in, just for a second, then walked on. James had been standing outside the room. He had seen the pause. Most people, and looking through a doorway at 2 children sitting with coloring books, would register, children, sitting, coloring, fine. James registered something different. The pause was a half-second too long. The eyes moved too specifically. Not the casual glance of someone checking whether they had the right room. Something more deliberate, something with a destination. He didn't move. He kept his position. Oh, but he opened his radio with 2 fingers and said 2 words to the backup officer at the end of the corridor. "Eyes on." Charlotte had heard this, because she heard everything. She looked up from the coloring book. She looked at James. His face was the neutral face, the no information face. But she had been watching that face for 8 months, and she could read it now the way she could read weather. Not the words, but the pressure, the slight shift that meant something had changed. Like she put her crayon down. Elise, next to her, was still coloring. She had not heard the radio. She did not know that James had just moved, almost imperceptibly, 1.5 feet closer to the door. Charlotte knew. She looked at James again. He looked at her, a full second, not his usual scan. His eyes said, "Stay where you are." She had never been given this look before, and she felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. Not with fear. Not yet. but with the absolute understanding that something real was happening, and the afternoon had just become a different afternoon than the one she had expected. She picked her crayon back up. She colored very carefully inside the lines. Outside the room, James keyed his radio again. Down the corridor, behind a door, the man in the dark suit had stopped walking. The corridor on the east side of the residential wing was not a corridor that guests were meant to use. This was not marked on any sign, and not announced at any point, but it was true the way many things at Windsor were true. Understood without being said, built into the architecture of expectation that governed how people moved through the palace. The residential wing had its own logic. Staff moved through the back passages. Family moved through the main ones. Guests moved through designated routes, accompanied, guided, never wandering. The man in the dark suit was in the east corridor. James got the confirmation through his earpiece at 2:17 p.m. The soft click of the backup officer's signal, then his voice, low and even. "East corridor, third door, moving slow." James stood outside the sitting room and ran the calculation in the 4 seconds he had before he needed to act. The third door in the east corridor was the access point to the secondary staircase. The secondary staircase connected to the ground floor. The ground floor, via the service passage, it connected to the garden where the afternoon walk was scheduled to begin in 40 minutes. There were many reasons a person could be in the east corridor. Most of them were benign. A wrong turn, a misremembered route, a legitimate errand that had taken an unexpected path. But the pause at the sitting room door sat in James's mind like something that had not yet made a sound, but was about to. He didn't leave his post. That was the first rule. The one that sat above every other rule. You do not leave the principal. You especially do not leave a 9-year-old principal in a room and go investigate a feeling. He stayed where he was and kept his eyes on the sitting room door and spoke quietly into his radio. And within 3 minutes there were 2 additional officers moving through the palace toward the east corridor from different directions. Inside the room, Charlotte was still coloring. And she was coloring with the particular focused intensity of a person who is using a task to manage something they do not yet have a name for. The coloring book was open to a page of woodland animals, a hedgehog, a fox, a badger arranged in a cozy domestic scene that was very far from whatever was happening in the corridor outside. She pressed the crayon hard into the paper. The fox became a very saturated shade of orange. Elise, next to her, was humming something and working on the hedgehog with a brown crayon, and had the relaxed body language of someone with no idea that anything had changed. Charlotte envied this slightly. She wanted to ask James what was happening. She was old enough to understand that she could not ask James what was happening, that asking would require him to say something reassuring that was either true and therefore probably fine, or not true, and she didn't want either of those conversations at this exact moment. She wanted the information, but not what came with it. She understood this was an unreasonable wish. She chose a new color for the badger, because the badger needed to be done before she was allowed to feel anything. At 2:23 p.m., the situation in the east corridor clarified. The man in the dark suit was not a member of the visiting delegation's official household staff. This took 4 minutes to establish. 4 minutes of cross-referencing the staff manifest that the visiting family's advance team had submitted 48 hours prior against the description coming over the radio. 4 minutes during which James stood in the corridor outside the sitting room with his shoulders very still and the rest of him very alert and the kind of focused that looks, from the outside, like calm. He was not calm. Calm was a different thing. This was controlled tension, which is tension given direction. But the man had a credential. The credential was real. It had the right hologram, the right format, the right number. It had been issued. It was in the system. What it did not have, what took another 2 minutes to surface when the right person pulled the right file, was an authorization to be in this part of the palace on this day. The credential covered public areas. It covered the greeting rooms and the main reception spaces. It did not cover residential wing access. And he was somewhere he was not supposed to be, with documentation that said he was allowed to be somewhere else. This was the moment that tipped it. James opened the sitting room door. He stepped inside. He looked at both children, Charlotte looking up at him immediately, Elise still focused on the hedgehog, and he said in the same voice he used for everything, steady and matter-of-fact, "We're going to move to the yellow sitting room now. It's closer to the garden." Charlotte stood up immediately. She didn't ask why. She didn't make it complicated. 8 months of watching James Calloway had taught her what his face looked like when it was telling her something that his words were not, and she read the language of this without effort. She closed the coloring book. She tucked her crayon. She looked at Elise and said in a perfectly normal voice, "Come on. There's better light in the other room." Elise came. James moved them through the corridor at a pace that was brisk without being a run, and Charlotte kept herself at Elise's side and talked about birds, specifically cassowaries, because she had found this topic to be reliable. And Elise responded, and the conversation worked as a kind of scaffolding over the thing underneath it, the thing that neither of them mentioned, which was that they were moving faster than a casual relocation required. And the yellow sitting room was on the opposite side of the building. It had 2 officers already inside it when they arrived. Charlotte noticed this. She said nothing. She settled herself on the window seat, different window, same gray sky, and opened the bird book she had been carrying, which she had picked up from the bedroom windowsill that morning and somehow still had carried it through the whole morning without thinking about it. And she looked at the page it fell open to. Oh, the robin, her grandmother's favorite. The spine, new. Elise sat next to her and looked at the pictures. "Your guard," Elise said after a minute. "He's very serious." "Yes," Charlotte said. "Ours is less serious." "What's yours like?" Elise considered this. "He laughs at jokes sometimes. He once tripped on a rug and knocked over a vase, and my mother's face was very funny." Charlotte thought about James tripping on a rug. She thought about this for a full 5 seconds. "Yeah, James doesn't trip on rugs," she said. "Has he ever?" "I don't think he would allow it." This was not entirely a joke, and Elise seemed to understand this, and they both looked at the robin. Down the hall, James was standing in a doorway with 2 other officers and a senior member of palace security, and they were talking in the compressed shorthand of people who have trained together and do not need complete sentences. The man in the dark suit had been located. He was sitting in a small anteroom near the east service entrance, with his document case on his lap and his hands visible. And he was being very cooperative in the way that people are when they know exactly how much trouble they are in and have decided that cooperation is the only option remaining to them. What he had in the document case was not a weapon. What he had was a camera, a professional-grade camera with a long lens, and the kind of equipment that could take a clear photograph from a considerable distance, and an envelope of notes, handwritten, in a foreign language that the officer standing over him could not read, that described the garden walk scheduled for that afternoon, the route, the time, the names of the children expected to participate. It was not an assassination. It was not a threat in the physical, immediate sense of that word. It was something less than that, and also in a different way, and something more troubling. A person who had moved through the wrong doors with the right paperwork in order to photograph a 9-year-old princess at close range for reasons that were not yet clear and that would take considerably more hours of questioning to become clear. James stood in the doorway and processed this, and felt the specific feeling of having been right about something you never want to be right about. He went back to the yellow sitting room. Charlotte was still on the window seat. She had not moved. The bird book was still open on her lap, the robin, and she was watching the door when he came in, which meant she had been watching the door for a while, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was holding herself carefully. when she was being 9 and also being a princess and managing the distance between those two things. He sat in the chair across from her. This was not something he normally did. While he was not normally in her space in that way, in the social furniture of a room, he was normally beside a door, near a wall, at the edges of things. She looked at him. "Is everything sorted?" she asked. She used the word sorted the way she had heard adults use it, as a word that meant, "Is the thing you cannot tell me about under control enough that I can stop holding my shoulders like this?" "It's sorted," he said. She breathed out, just slightly, just enough. Elise had fallen asleep, and somehow sideways on the window seat with her cheek on her folded hands, the way children can fall asleep in inconvenient places when nothing is actively required of them. Charlotte looked at her and then looked back at James. "She didn't know, did she?" "No." Charlotte nodded slowly. She looked out the window at the gray sky. "I think that's probably better," she said. James thought this was an interesting and true thing for a 9-year-old to say, and he wrote nothing down. That's because there was no notebook category for it. But he did not forget it. Outside, the fog had burned off. The garden was visible now, the paths clear, the roses fully open, gold and pink against the wet grass. It would have been a good afternoon for a walk. It would have been a pleasant, unremarkable thing. 2 children in a garden, a guard at a respectful distance, birds in the hedges. It was not that afternoon. It was this one instead. The yellow sitting room, the sleeping girl, the bird book, the robin, the guard sitting in a chair instead of beside a wall, and the princess who had not cried, who had not asked for anything, who had picked her crayon back up and colored inside the lines and carried the morning's weight in the careful way she had been taught, and the slightly less careful way she was still figuring out. 3 weeks passed before Charlotte asked him about it. She waited 3 weeks the way you wait when you are 9 years old and have been told that not in words, but in every other way, that certain things are not asked about. She let the days move. She watched the trees in the garden go from the yellow green of late spring to the deeper, heavier green of early summer. She went to lessons. She attended the things she was supposed to attend. She read the bird book, all the way through this time, not just the robin, past the sparrow and the chaffinch and the field fare, and the birds she'd never seen and hoped one day to. And she thought about the afternoon in the yellow sitting room more often than she thought was probably normal, but she didn't ask. Then one morning she was in the east garden with her sketchbook, and James was standing near the garden wall doing what he always did, which was watching everything without appearing to watch anything, and she looked up from her drawing and said, without particularly deciding to, "Did you know there was going to be something wrong that day? Or did you just think there might be?" James was quiet for a moment. This was not unusual. He was often quiet. But she had learned the different textures of his quiet, the neutral quiet, the scanning quiet, the thinking quiet. And this was the thinking quiet, which meant he was deciding something. "I noticed something that seemed off," he said. "I wasn't certain." "But you moved us anyway." "Yes." She drew a line on her sketchbook that wasn't part of the bird she was sketching. Just a line. "What if you had been wrong?" "Then we would have moved rooms for no reason," he said. "Which is fine." She thought about this. She thought about the calculus of it, the choice between being wrong in the direction of caution and being wrong in the other direction. And she understood it. Not completely, but enough. She understood that his job was not to be certain. His job was to make decisions before certainty was available. And the direction of the mistake mattered more than avoiding the mistake entirely. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "The man with the camera." James looked at her then, the full look, not the sweep. "What have you been thinking?" "I've been thinking that it would have been worse not knowing," she said. Being in the garden and someone taking photographs and me not knowing. That would be worse, even if nothing bad was going to happen. She looked up from the sketchbook. Does that make sense? It does, he said. She went back to her drawing. It was a heron, tall and slightly prehistoric looking, one leg lifted, the way they stood in the shallows of rivers, as if they had all the time in the world, and also none of it. She had seen one from the car 3 days ago on a bridge over a stretch of shallow water, and she had looked at it for as long as the car's movement allowed, memorizing the posture, the stillness, the specific quality of attention it had, if she wanted to get it right. "James," she said. "Yes." "Is it always like that? The job, noticing things that are probably nothing?" He considered this for longer than the other questions. "Most of the time," he said. "Yes." "And when it's something?" He was quiet again. She waited. She had learned that waiting for his answers was worth the wait, because he did not give answers he didn't mean. "When it's something," he said, "you don't think about it the same way. The thinking stops and the doing starts. The thinking comes after." She nodded. She understood this too. The way that action fills the space that anxiety was occupying. The way the body knows what to do before the mind has finished its conversation with itself. She was 9, but she had had enough moments of this to recognize it. "Does the thinking after bother you?" she asked. "When it's something?" There was a very long pause. A heron pause. "All the time in the world, and none of it." "Or sometimes," he said. She wrote this down in the corner of the sketchbook page, next to the heron. Not the words, but a small mark she would understand later. A notation, because it felt important, and she did not want to forget it. The summer moved forward. There was an official inquiry into the incident, which was what it was called now, the incident, and James was interviewed 3 times by 2 different people in 2 different rooms. And he gave the same account each time with the same precision, the same sequence of events, the same language. He was not a man who changed his story because the story did not require changing. What had happened was what had happened. He had noticed a deviation. He had acted on it. The outcome had been appropriate. He had nothing to revise. And the man with the camera turned out to be a freelance photographer who had sold his access, his legitimately obtained credential, to a tabloid operation running a long-term project photographing the royal children at informal moments. Not a threat in the way that word is usually understood. A different kind of intrusion, a different kind of violation, and one that moved through legal corridors rather than criminal ones, but left the same feeling behind it, the feeling of something private being reached for by hands that had not been invited. He was prosecuted under the regulations governing unauthorized access to restricted areas. The tabloid published nothing. The photographs, taken in the moments before he was located, showed only corridors and a garden, empty. Charlotte was told a simplified version of this by her parents. She listened carefully and asked 2 questions. Had anyone else known he was there, and were there others like him? The answers were no and possibly, and she nodded and did not ask anything else, because the questions she actually had were not the kind that had clean answers, and she had begun to understand the difference. She thought about the heron, and she thought about what James had said. The thinking stops and the doing starts, and she thought about the particular kind of life it required to operate that way. To exist in a sustained state of attention and calibrated concern, to carry the weight of someone else's safety not as a burden, but as a habit, as a practiced skill, as something you became so accustomed to that it stopped feeling like anything except normal. She thought about the 17 birds in his notebook. She thought about cassowaries. She thought about the fact that he had sat in a chair in the yellow sitting room instead of standing beside the door. This was the thing she kept returning to, not the drama of the day, not the man with the camera, or the movement through corridors, or the radio with its two-word signals. Those were events. They had happened and were over. What stayed with her was the smaller thing, the chair, the sitting, the deliberate choice to be present in a different way when the day had been long and the girl in the window seat was holding herself carefully. She did not know enough yet to know how to value this correctly. She was 9. But she knew that it mattered, and she knew why it mattered, in the way you know some things before you have the vocabulary for them. In August, she started a new sketchbook. The first page was the heron, that redrawn from memory and better than the first version, more precise at the neck, the legs more convincingly architectural, the sense of stillness more fully achieved. On the second page, she wrote, in her careful school-practiced handwriting, a list. It was headed, Things That Are True, and it had 7 items, the last of which was that sometimes the most important thing a person does is notice something quietly and act on it without anyone knowing that it happened, and that this is not a small thing. She was 9 years old. James Calloway stood outside the door of the library where she was working and moved his eyes in their slow arc, gates, path, garden wall, the door, and found nothing wrong, and found this entirely unsurprising, and kept going. The palace day moved around them both like water moving around stones, finding its level, finding its channels, filling the shapes that were already there. The roses had gone over by now, their petals browning at the edges, and the birds in the east garden had shifted from the nesting calls of spring to the territorial declarations of late summer, loud and unnecessary and full of feeling. Charlotte listened to them. She had learned to identify 11 species by call alone. She had told James this 2 weeks ago, standing in this same garden, and he had produced the small notebook from his inside jacket pocket without any drama, clicked his pen, and said, "Which ones?" She had listed them in order of her confidence, and he had written them down, and she had watched the care with which he wrote, the same care he brought to everything, deliberate, without waste. And she thought that there were many different ways to pay attention to the world, and that some of them looked like standing by a door, and some of them looked like drawing herons, and some of them looked like writing down the names of birds because a person you were responsible for had learned to hear them, and all of these were, at their root, the same practice. The same practice. She was still figuring this out. She had time.